This video is for AQA A-Level Economics. It's the paper 3, which is the synoptic paper, and it's called Economic Principles and Issues. And it's going to focus on the 15 marker from June 2024. So the question was, explain why investment in infrastructure in the less prosperous regions could help to improve the prosperity of people living in these regions. Now, often with paper 3, the 15 markers, they seem quite straightforward. And usually students come out of the exam quite confident. They think it's very accessible, but unfortunately it gives them a little bit of a false sense of security, and it does sometimes result in complacency where students don't necessarily answer it with the same kind of respect they would for maybe a more challenging question. And what they tend to do, and this is especially what I noticed when marking for the exam board, they seem to be quite generic. And therefore, you have to give it the respect as you would with any question and show off that you're an A-level economist and make sure that you use the technical terminology and make sure that your analysis is sophisticated as it can be to really help get those higher marks. Now, in this question, there's two focuses. The first one is of course investment. And I don't think I saw any student drift away from investment. Investment was the key focus of every response that I marked. But some students did neglect the second one, and that is economic prosperity. And that could have been because students weren't quite sure what it was, or they just didn't quite read and recognise the importance of that to the answer. You could start off with an introduction, and it could be a definition. And if you are going to define, I'd define them both, not just investment, but also economic prosperity as well. Because what it might do is it might just kind of re-emphasize in your own head that you need to refer back to it and return to it in every issue. So, of course, investment refers to the spending on capital, and it involves the allocation of resources to increase productive capacity. But economic prosperity refers to high and improving living standards, where regions will have greater income, wealth, and access to goods and services. So you have to either allude to that or directly refer to that in each of your issues. Now, the mark scheme to get the highest level, which is a level 3, from marks 11 to 15, a good response expects it to be organised. Now, how I would organise a 15 marker, especially in a paper 3, is I'd target 3 issues. Now, the reason why I'd go for 3 issues is that sometimes what I find is when students do 2 issues, if one of those issues is weak, it really limits their response. And by doing 3 issues, it does spread a bit of risk. And what you'll find actually, there's so many extracts in this case study, and there's so many potential issues that you can identify, you should be absolutely fine for 3 issues. You have to show sound knowledge. So this is what I mean about making sure that your response isn't generic and you really use technical terminology. You do refer back to economic principles and economic concepts. And you don't just regurgitate what's in the case study. Yes, you need to use the case study. That is part of your application. And yes, it should drive your points. But as soon as you find your evidence, let your theory and let your analysis take over. And that analysis has to be clear, it has to be logical, and it has to have a complete chain of reasoning. Do not allow the examiner to ask that question of why. If they can ask that question of why throughout your argument, it means that there's something missing and it's incomplete. So, my observations from marking this, and I've marked a lot of these, of the June 2024 paper in terms of these 15 markers. So I'm just going to pick out some key ones that I saw. So first of all, we're going to focus on what the senior examiner expected. There was an expectation of you considering both the supply side and the demand side in this question. What I noticed from marking these 15 markers is that sometimes students just focus on the supply side, or they just focus on the demand side, and they didn't necessarily consider both. And if you did consider both, you had a greater chance of getting into that level 3. So really what I was looking for in a diagram is not only an AD shift showing demand side improvements, but a long run aggregate supply shift showing supply side improvements as well. Now, talking about diagrams, what I also found was sometimes students were a little bit basic when looking at demand side improvements, and they would just do simply a demand shift to the right, when actually there was scope to really consider multiplier effects. Now, some students did look at multipliers, but they often neglected the initial injection. Now, the initial injection was the investment, and often students forgot about that initial investment when talking about the multiple shifts in AD. Now, you have to remember the investment itself is the injection, and then the overall impact of that on national income is going to be the effects of the multiplier. And some students kind of failed to find that link. Now, my second observation is to do the case study, and it's just to do with those students who use the case study. They could identify the issues, and those issues they were more logical. So from this, what we can see in this extract, it mentions about pretty much geographic mobility and the importance of improving geographic mobility, especially in terms of the outdated rail network. So you should have been really emphasising examples of Manchester recruiting from cities like Bradford and struggling to, or the fast broadband in terms of the digital infrastructure that was needed. That would have just helped to drive your analysis and your theory. Now, the other issue was that sometimes students picked a certain part of the extract and then they overly focused on it. So I've mentioned there two examples of geographic mobility improvements. So if they invested in the outdated rail network or if they invested in digital infrastructure, they would both be examples. But some students considered that to be two separate issues, when really it's just one issue. But if you had looked at other parts of the case study, what you would have found is that there were other clues. So some clues in terms of educational attainment. So if you know that you're wanting to do 2 points on the supply side improvements, try to spread it in terms of two different impacts. So geographic mobility, occupational mobility, that would have been fine. So I'll give you an example of this when I go through my exemplar. But even looking at this, there are clues in terms of, so if I go back to this, it says it can help to boost the short run growth and bring about a long run improvement in productivity. So again, referring back to the supply side and the demand side improvements, that has been put in that extract for a reason. They are dropping subtle hints to the student. You just need to find them. And I know that can be challenging in obviously exam pressure in terms of time conditions. But if you are able to identify it, it can make a massive difference in terms of the structure of your response. So my third observation, and that was to do with the structure and the technique. What I found was a lot of students were making mistakes in terms of writing evaluation. So never ever evaluate in a 15 marker. The command term is explain and you'd simply be wasting time. There's only two types of questions that you're going to evaluate in this economics exam series. And it's going to be the 25 marker, which you're going to do in paper 1, 2 and 3. And then in paper 3, it's going to be the 10 marker. But you'll never ever evaluate in a 15 marker. All right, so just look out for that. Because what I was finding as well is some students were writing 2 issues and an evaluation. Well, the evaluation didn't award them any marks at all, but it did actually cost them. It was an opportunity cost of they could have used that time to allocate it towards a third issue, and they never did. And that was a shame because actually it would have probably strengthened their response. So remember, the key to this is that chain of reasoning. They're wanting you to build an argument as to why investment would boost economic prosperity. And you need to make sure that that chain is complete. There is no questions of why. There's nothing to suggest that there's incomplete chains. You need to consider the development and the development strands to make that completed issue. So this is my first issue. So investment can be used to boost the geographic mobility of labour within regions. So I've used the examples of digital and transport infrastructure. And I've also referred to structural unemployment, and I've looked at the data of unemployment in more of the earlier figures. So I've said that by enabling individuals to have access to jobs across the country, it can match their skills to more productive jobs, consequently reducing this figure and increasing regional labour productivity and the supply side of the region. So if investment is used to improve the poor connectivity, particularly the outdated rail networks, it can, for example, match high-skilled labour from Bradford to higher productive jobs in Manchester by speeding up the commute time. Furthermore, digital technology such as fast broadband can enable those in the North East region still to access jobs by working from home, even if such employees are in the South East. So when labour moves freely, and this is key, when labour moves freely, workers can accept vacancies, meaning the economy allocates resources more effectively, rather than those workers in the North East remaining voluntarily unemployed or underemployed, and that's going to improve economic prosperity by increased income equality. My second issue, I've still gone for supply side. So investment can continue to support the supply side improvements by increasing occupational mobility. So I've looked at the capital stock regarding education. So like, for example, schools, universities. So by investing in these facilities, it can encourage promising students to live and study in such areas, as well as supporting skill development. So increased attainment would boost transferable skills, again helping to reduce structural unemployment, but also it improves the quality of labour, especially in those regions. So if they graduate and they stay in those regions, then that is going to result in higher regional output from skilled labour, and it's going to support economic prosperity by increasing individual earnings. This is the type of diagram that I would do. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to link my issue 1, 2 with my next issue, my third issue. So I've decided to just do one diagram, but the diagram shows the demand side and the supply side improvements and the multiplier effect as well. So my third issue is my demand side improvement, and I've talked about the initial injection of investment, and I've talked about that investment is going to require spending on materials, construction, wages. You can think about architects, all sorts. So that's going to require planning, it's going to require construction, and therefore it's going to create jobs. And that's not just during, but it's also after the completion of the infrastructure as well. So the construction of transport infrastructure may generate a multiplier effect because it leads to multiple rounds of increased spending, investment and productivity. So workers employed in construction and related industries spend their wages on goods and services in such regions, which will obviously help support those businesses. But not only this, but ports, rail links and airport facilities, faster and cheaper trade, which could stimulate more demand from northern businesses. So not only does it help domestically, but it can also support with export potential, making their exports more competitive. So that causes an overall impact as seen from Y1 to Y3.